Hello, everyone. My name is Gilda Ross. I'm the Glenbard Student and Community Projects Coordinator. It's a busy time of year, but I'm so glad that you're here to join us for this very, very important question. Dr. Timothy Wahlberg is joining us today. It's very nice when we can invite someone more local, so we're really excited about that. You saw the slide of all the organizations that make this possible. We want to take a minute and thank them. But most importantly, we want to thank you for the gift of your time to be here today. We always want to let you know that you are welcome here as we welcome your friends, your neighbors, your relatives next door or around the country. GPS is free for everyone, and our ask of you is to please share. So please do that as we begin today's really important question. Quickly, I want to tell you about upcoming events. We're closing out with this important program December, and as we look forward to January, you'll definitely want to mark your calendar for these very, very important events. Just to start, we have Dr. Emily Bratton. She will be with us on January 9th, Thursday. Her book is called Bright Kids Who Couldn't Care Less. I know we all know someone who would benefit from a program like that. She'll be with us to kick us off in January. And then we're going to be welcoming Dr. Bruce Perry. He and Oprah Winfrey are the authors of a book called What Happened to You? A Shift from What is Wrong with You. And they'll be joining us the second week on January 15th at noon and 7 p.m. Donna Jackson Nakasawa will continue the conversation on trauma on Thursday, January 16th, with her book, Adverse Childhood Experiences, a Guided Journal. So we have Dr. Perry on Wednesday talking about trauma, and then Donna Jackson Nakasawa the next night talking about childhood experiences at noon and 7 p.m. A very, very important program coming up. We're excited to welcome for the first time Ellen Galinsky. Her important book, Mind in the Making, was many years ago, and now she's done a deep dive into adolescence with her important book, The Breakthrough Years, a new scientific framework for raising thriving teens, January 22nd, noon and 7 p.m. So share, join us, and we'll see you then. And now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Erin Hoving. She is the transition specialist for Glenbard and the youth services coordinator for DRS. She has the honor of the introductions. So Erin, please take it away.
Thank you, Gilda. Dr. Tim Wahlberg is the author of Finding the Gray and a licensed clinical psychologist and certified school psychologist. He has experience working in a school and university setting, psychiatric facility, and community mental health center, as well as in private practice. Dr. Wahlberg has published extensively on the subjects of autism and neurological impairments and is involved in several ongoing research projects of related topics. He has spoken at local and national levels on autism and neurodevelopmental delays and has conducted a number of training seminars in this area. He is the member of the American Psychological Association, and we are delighted to welcome him to GPS today. Thank you, Dr. Wahlberg.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me get my slides going. All right. So what we're going to talk about today is strengthening social skills in children and adolescents. What I want to do today is try to get through my slides. We've kind of decided that I'm certainly going to leave time at the end. I'm going to try to do my due diligence to get through my slides as quickly as possible. If you have questions and they're just burning in you and you want to ask one, I suppose, while I'm presenting, it's just fine. But I promise I'll leave some time at the end for questions. I've included my email. If you have a question you don't want to ask today or you think about it afterwards, go ahead and shoot me an email. I have my website on there if you want to see the people that kind of work at the clinic. And then I have the website for my book, Finding the Gray. I will tell you a lot of what we're going to cover today is covered in great detail in Finding the Gray. If you want a deeper dive into what we're talking about, you're welcome to do that. So you have my contact information. Ms. Ross and I spoke earlier. If you want a copy of the PowerPoint, that's no problem. This is a short version of strengthening social skills. We could spend, literally probably hours on this topic. So my goal is to give you a general overview of kind of what I see where it comes from. because I think if you know where it's coming from, it's a little easier to develop strategies or learn how to manage it, and increase social skills in individuals you're working with. So I'm going to run through that. I'm going to talk about things like motivation, things like personality, some of the basics that we can teach along the way. So I'm going to get started with that. Do you know how I move the slides?
There should be a little.
There we go. It's working now.
Okay.
Whatever I clicked made it work. So one of the basics I want to just spend a couple minutes on is talking about some of the whys behind social deficits. And again, I know this doesn't get into what we do, but I think you need to have an understanding of what's going on, developmentally and neurologically in individuals that really struggle socially. I work with a great deal of individuals on the autism spectrum, and part of the diagnostic criteria in being on the spectrum is having social challenges or social deficits, and they're clinically significant deficits. So if you look at development and you look at somebody that has social deficits, when you look at how our neurological systems develop, we're really what I call an energy transformation system. So we start out and we're trying to process the world around us. We're trying to make sense of it. As when we're babies, it's more of a survival mechanism where we're trying to eat, we're trying to sleep. But as we start to mature, we get to probably 2, 3, 4 years old. What happens is we start to compare ourselves to others, and we have in our bodies, in our brains, we have mirror neurons, which allow us to watch and learn and focus on what's happening around us. And it allows us to actually feel what other people feel. So what mirror neurons do, when you look at somebody, you're using your visual system, you're watching what they look like, and your muscles in your face actually move a little bit, not that anyone else would see. And that information is transferred to your brain. So you're actually physically mirroring what you're seeing, and then you're actually feeling at an emotional level what's happening. So mirror neurons start to develop at the age of 3. 3, 4, 5-year-olds are already paying attention to what other people are doing. They're watching, they're learning. They're learning by experiences. They're learning by what other people, we don't even have to have the experience. We can watch somebody else have the experience and learn from that. So that's what happens in normal development. A lot of the kids I see that have social challenges, they're more in a survival mechanism, and that carries through to 3, 4, 5, and developmentally it carries on as they're overstimulated by the environment. They're overwhelmed by the environment. So I describe our brains as if everybody had the same energy, which I think we all do, I describe it as a 9-volt battery. And as we mature and we get better at doing things, it requires less energy. So when baby first learns to walk, all 9 volts have to go into the act of walking. If you talk to a baby that's just learning to walk and they take any of those volts away from walking, they usually tip over because they all have to go into that process or that mechanism. The more we do it, the better we get, the more efficient we get. That's what I mean by the brain's an energy transformation system. So when these lower level systems are functioning the way they should be, we're processing the environment the way we should, we can then put energy or some of those 9 volts into socializing. When I see kids that are struggling taking in the environment when they're little, their energy is more focused on how do I control the environment, because the environment's overstimulating, it's having a negative impact. So the problem with that for a lot of my kids is they're focusing on the physical environment, but they're not really focusing on the social environment because they're more into that survival mechanism. And then they really want control, and the more control they feel, the less their anxiety is. So these are kids that don't want the room arranged. Christmas, we're in the holidays right now. Oh my goodness, for a lot of my kids, they don't want a Christmas tree in the house. They don't want the couch moved because that creates anxiety. So in those, for a lot of those kids, we're learning to control. We're trying to calm ourselves down at the expense of developing socially. So we're not really focusing on what's happening socially around us. That also, we want consistency and sameness. The social interaction is not always the same. It's not always consistent. So these are things I just want you to think about. I told you I'd only spend a couple minutes on it, but I think you need to know the foundation of where it's coming from to understand what we see in the end. What we see in the end are kids that aren't necessarily socializing, don't really know what to do, don't know how to engage, don't establish friendships. And this is really kind of the root of where it comes from. What I also want, I couldn't stress anymore, and I talk about this a ton in my book, is I strongly believe that personality comes first, and whatever exceptionality might be involved in the equation comes second. And a lot of people struggle with this. A lot of people have a certain stereotype for, oh, autism means we're in the bedroom, we're on videos, we're playing video games. And I would say, yes, absolutely. That's half the kids I see. But the other half the kids I see are extroverts. They really want to be out there. They want to have friends. They try to engage. As kids get older, sometimes I see what I call a withdrawn extrovert because they want to be in the mix. They want to be around other people, but they're not, it's not working for them. So then they kind of withdraw, even though they're truly extroverted. But in my office, I see just as many extroverted kids with social challenges as introverted kids. So I think we really have to have that level of understanding. It's a completely different profile. I have a little girl right now trying to fit in. She's in middle school. We're trying to teach her how to socialize. And I know this sounds crazy, but it's almost like I want her to say less because she's trying to be funny, and she says things and they miss. And now I have a whole different issue because she doesn't understand why Susie's mad at her because she was just trying to be funny. And she heard somebody else say that to Susie. And then this complex dynamic starts where if, and I'm going to talk about this in the presentation, I'm trying to teach her how to maybe not joke around as much, maybe ask more concrete questions. How was your weekend? What are you doing this weekend? Things like that, which I'll get into. But I want you to understand that personality really comes first. The introverted kids that I work with, those are the kids that it's hard to get them out of the house. It's hard to get them to do things because they are much more introverted. They would rather spend time with themselves. Either way, introversion or extroversion, kids still want friends. So introverted people still have friends. Maybe it's one friend, maybe it's two friends. So I tease a lot. My brother is very introverted, and I would be more on the extroverted side. And nobody's 100% either way, but generally speaking, he's more introverted. So, he wants to go camping. He wants to invite 3 people. And I bring up, why don't invite the whole neighborhood? And he goes bananas. He's like, why would we do that? I don't understand why you'd want to do that. He still has friends. He's still married. He still has kids, but it's a different way of looking at things. Also, keep in mind, a lot of introverted kids want to problem solve on their own, or even introverted adults. And extroverted individuals, such as myself, I like to problem solve with other people. I like more minds in the mix. I want to sit in a group of people and say, who's thought of this? What do you guys think of that? Where introverted kids tend to want to problem solve on their own. So that is something when we talk about social skills. I'm not going to talk a ton about this today, but advocating is a huge functional life skill. So for kids learning to advocate, that's huge, especially as they get a little bit older. I tell people, I think the #1 predictor of success when my kids go from high school to college is whether they can advocate. So I have a young man in this morning in my office, and he's getting ready to go to college next fall. We've spent lots of time talking about it, but as long as he continues to advocate and he speaks up when he's stressed, he speaks up when he doesn't understand, things tend to go a lot better. And we're going to get into mind shift and some of those things that apply, but I want you to understand, really, when we're looking at social, we're looking at anything, any kids maybe on the spectrum, we really have to understand that their personality comes first. The only thing they're similar on is the social deficit. How it kind of plays out can be very different if you have an introverted versus an extroverted individual. But that's the one thing that's similar is the social challenge. So what I see with social development, when we're really struggling with this, a lot of my kids, mostly my girls, I call them like chameleons. They kind of adapt to what other people are doing, what other people are wearing, what other people are saying. And within this, they really, a lot of times, don't develop a sense of identity. So the reason I put this in here, and I want you to think about it, it's one thing to develop social skills, but we also have to focus on developing a sense of identity. Like, who are you? And being confident in who you are. Generally speaking, what we do as we're growing up and we're developing socially is we might take bits and pieces from different things to create who we are. I decide whether it jives with me, whether I like something that one of my friends is doing growing up or what one of my friends is thinking. And I might take a bit from Jeff, a bit from Tom, a bit from Joe, a bit from my mom, a bit from my grandpa. But that's how I develop that sense of identity. When I'm a chameleon, I'm not developing a sense of identity. I am just doing what Tom is doing. I'm dressing like Tom, I'm talking like Tom, I'm thinking like Tom. So it's a difficult situation when I'm really working with kids. I spend just as much time trying to get them to be confident and understand who they are, and it's okay to be who they are. I think we live in a society today, way more than when I grew up, that it's okay to be different. I would say that's hard in middle school. Middle school, I don't know if you all remember, I did not particularly like middle school. I have never met anyone in my entire life that says, boy, I wish I could go back to middle school. I wish I could go through puberty again. Most of us just try to survive middle school. But as we develop, we understand it's okay to be different. You know, middle school, you certainly don't want to be different. You want to be like everyone else. You want to fit in. You don't want to be different. You know, bullying's at its peak in middle school. I unfortunately think it's part of normal development. Unfortunately, we can't stop it. It's just part of it. If we make fun of people that are different, we try to build ourselves up. All of that stuff happens really in middle school. But when I look at as we move forward, it is okay to be different. And we've got to get kids to understand that and really have a voice with who they are. So I want you to keep that in mind. And I talked about this a little bit before. Watching and learning is a big piece of it. So what I'm going to get into in a little bit is as parents, as therapists, as teachers, as friends, to really focus on learning through experiences. So one of the things that does not work with individuals on the spectrum is for me to tell them about my experience. I really have to stay focused on what they've experienced, what they've been through. So I talk about prompting prior. What I mean by that is, and I have a couple other slides to talk about this, but I really want families and therapists and teachers to get kids to think about it before they're in the moment, because they don't remember things. So the problem with executive functioning, you think about touching a hot stove. If I touch a hot stove, the next time I'm around the stove, when executive functioning kicks in, I don't touch the stove because I think, oh, last time I did that, it kind of hurt. With social development, that's higher level development. It's not like the hot stove. So a lot of my kids, it's like Groundhog Day. It's the same. I mean, we just talked about it yesterday. You did it again today. So what really helps with that is the prompting prior, and then to bring up their own experiences. For people that don't have some of those same social challenges, we learn from what other people tell us. But it's a much different animal when you're talking about kids, maybe kids on the spectrum or kids with some of these social challenges. The watching and learning really needs to be prompted as well, because they're not necessarily paying attention to it. So an example of that is, I think about my daughters. My daughters, when they were little, we used to play Foursquare in my driveway waiting for the bus. And my little one was too little to play, but she would listen to everything that was going on. And so when they would tell a joke, my daughter would laugh. My daughter was paying attention. A lot of kids with some of these social challenges are looking at the flower with the caterpillar on it. So they're really not doing that same watching and learning. So they're not processing things that are going on. And then they're not also applying that executive functioning, learning from the experiences, like watching something happen and saying, I will never say that. I will never pick my nose in front of people because I saw the way Susie reacted when Joe picked his nose. She said it was gross, but all the girls said it was gross. A lot of my kids are looking out the window at the bird. So they're not even having that experience. So a lot of social development comes from manually teaching. Most kids, to teach social development, you just send them to school. Just have them walk through the door. We don't really have a social curriculum. We don't go through that with kids because kids kind of learn it on the fly. So these are all things that I really want you to think about, moving forward in social development. So higher level is the communicating or standing in front of somebody, but you got to understand the lower level and where the teaching comes from and where a lot of the work comes from is getting them to understand these things and working through their own experiences, because that's what they learn from. So when I talk about learning through experiences, what I have a lot of my parents do is take data, write down the experience, what happened in as much detail as you can, because the beauty of it is we can stimulate executive functioning. So if they get the notebook out and say, hey, Tim, do you remember last Tuesday when you were going to, the group at school? Do you remember what happened? And you go through that. Now you're stimulating executive functioning because you can take their brains there. You can go through that, and then we can say, what are we going to do differently tonight? What did we learn from last week? So a lot of it is manual. You don't really have to do that with other kids. But for kids on the spectrum or kids with social challenges, you really have to take them back to the experience so they can remember it and learn from it. This applies to problem solving. This applies to thinking out loud. I have a lot of my parents walk through social situations and process verbally what you're thinking in your brain. Things like problem solving. I give an example of buying a Christmas gift. When you get in your car to go to the store, you've already done 90% of the problem solving in your brain. You know what they want, you know what you're going to spend, you know where you're going to go. So I try to get a lot of my families and therapists to think out loud, walk them through that. See if they can do it on their own. So sit down at the kitchen table 20 minutes before you're going Christmas shopping and ask these questions. I do the same thing for socializing. You're getting ready to go out and go to the group, go with your friends, go to the band concert. Let's talk about what we're going to say. What are we going to do? How is that going to look? What did you do last time? Because if we don't do that, they're not necessarily processing in the moment. Another thing I do as a parent, it's hard to watch, but I know the Disney Channel exists. I call it egregious overacting. When I started my career 25 years ago, I would have a lot of families watch soap operas because, again, it's a little easier to see the overacting. And then what I'll have families do is stop. It's so much easier today. You stop the program and you're trying to see what is your son or daughter picking up socially from what's going on. So Disney Channel operates a lot like I grew up watching Three's Company. Three's Company had two different types of humor in it. Jack Tripper was, tripping and falling. You had the slapstick comedy that was funny. He runs into the door jam. But the true comedy of Three's Company was the misperception that Jack had every show. He thinks Chrissy's pregnant, but he overhears the last part of the conversation. Chrissy's not pregnant. It's actually her sister or her cousin or the neighbor. So the whole episode is this play on comedy of a social miscue, what he missed socially. The Disney Channel is very much the same. So the beauty of stopping it, thinking out loud, rewinding it, problem solving, is I can rewind it and get a child, listen to what they said. What did they say here? Why? So my kids watch Drake and Josh. It's not been on for years. They're probably in their 40s now, but Drake and Josh, the comedy was you got the real popular brother and the frumpy brother. And, there's an episode where a girl likes the popular brother, but uses the frumpy brother. And my kids are laughing. It's so funny because the frumpy brother thinks the girl actually likes him. And the whole comedy, what my daughters are laughing at is the fact that he's missing what's going on from a social perspective. So these are simple things you can do. Just stop it. Just ask, what's so funny? Why are we laughing right now? Because many of the shows that we watch, there's a social component to the comedy. Obviously it's not, the Three Stooges are a great example of no language, funny because we're poking, slapping, hitting, tripping. But as kids developmentally get a little bit older, it's that social aspect that becomes funny. So it's something to keep in mind as you're working with kids. Now, another thing that comes up a lot is what to do in these situations. So one of the things that I tell all my families that to understand is how we make friends, generally speaking, is when we're in a group. So let me explain. So a lot of people think, well, you just go to school, you make friends. Well, if I go to my math class, there's a proximity issue. So I'm going to sit next to 2 or 3 students. I don't get a choice. Maybe I do in the beginning, but it's kind of a random. I sit down and maybe I like the guy next to me, maybe not. But I also don't get to know him really at a higher level because we sit down, we say hi, and the teacher lectures. And then we leave and go to the next class. So I see Joe for 42 minutes, may or may not talk to him, but I'm really not getting to know him. So for us, if you think back to growing up, and you maybe made a friend in one of your classes, but there's a higher probability you make a friend in groups. And the reason I say that is when I go to a group, I get a chance to get to know people at a different level. I get to know what they're talking about. There's downtime, there's unstructured time. I can say, how was your weekend? What do you do for fun? What are you doing this weekend? And then I tell a lot of families, and you all can see if this applies to you. There's a social construct called the 1/3 rule. It's fairly well researched, and what it says is 1/3 of the people you meet you may like, and they may like you. So there's potential friendships there. A third of the people you meet are more neutral. Yeah, you don't really like or dislike them. They're just kind of there. And a third of the people we meet, we may not like, and they may not like us. Not that we've done anything wrong. They just have a different view of things. They see the world differently. And I remember reading about this decades ago, and I applied it to, and I had a biased sample size, but I applied it to the dads on the sidelines of my daughter's soccer team. So it's already biased. We're all there for the same reason, right? All there to watch soccer. I'm not really standing talking with all the moms. I'm kind of talking with the dads, right? But when I read that research and I thought about it, a third of the dads I like, a third of the dads I really didn't have an opinion on, and a third of the dads I didn't like. Didn't like how they treated their kids. I didn't like how they treated their wives. I didn't like them yelling at the refs. Whatever it was, they didn't do anything wrong to me. I just didn't jive with them. So when you take the group concept or a social outing concept and also the math class concept, if I have to meet 3 people for the potential to make a friend. So for a lot of my kids, it's hard, and I'm going to talk about the anxiety piece in a minute, but I don't want to go to the group. I don't want to put myself out there. I don't want to. I want to go home. I want to go home and relax and play my video games. And I get that. These kids are so overstimulated and so overwhelmed in school. But we're talking about how to take that next step as far as increasing the social possibilities of making friends. So I say you got to meet 9 people. 3 of those people you're going to jive with. Maybe one becomes a friend. Maybe becomes a good friend. But it's a numbers game. And you can't play the numbers game sitting in your bedroom. And this might come up. I'm just going to cover it real quick. My kids have friends on the internet. One's in Australia, one's in Switzerland, one's in Canada, one's in California. I can't argue that they don't talk to these people, that they don't form some sort of relationship. But I'm talking about interpersonal, like let's go have a pizza. Let's go bowling. I'm going to homecoming. I'm looking at it a little different because I can't really argue those aren't friends. You're just not going to get that same engagement as you would if you were in person. So one of the most basic things I talk about, a lot of my kids, believe it or not, I don't care how old they are, they don't understand the importance of listening. If you're talking about something, they don't care about it, they're tuning out. And when it comes to listening, I think what happens in conversation, the analogy I give, it's like we start the conversation, it's like the trunk of a tree. We start this conversation, we bring up a topic. It's a trunk of the tree. The more we talk, we kind of go out on a branch. And then we get a little more specific in another branch, and another branch. And all of a sudden, we're at a leaf. We're all talking about the leaf, something very specific with the leaf. But I have to be motivated. I have to stay with the conversation, whether I like the conversation or not. So COVID has kind of taken my groups to another level where it just kind of destroyed them. But all I really tried to do in group is get kids to listen to what the other kids were saying. So what I did in group, it was very simple, very black and white. Everyone gets a turn to check in. And I said to them, within reason, you say what you want. I don't care what you say for check-in. Tell me what you did on the weekend. Tell me a video game you're playing. You can say whatever you want. I can't make people talk, but I wanted them to check in. Some kids would be in my group for 6 months before they would check in. Then what I did after I finished checking in, or the student finished checking in, everybody in the group had to go around and ask at least one question related to what that person said for check-in. So your question can't be what you eat for breakfast unless they talked about breakfast. So if they said, I took a trip to Florida, then the next person who was going to ask a question had to say, where'd you go in Florida? What'd you do in Florida? Where'd you eat in Florida? What was the most fun in Florida? And I would do that hour after hour after hour. And then what I saw after, and this doesn't happen overnight, months and months, then my groups would start in my waiting room. And I'd open the door to the waiting room and the kids are talking. How was your weekend? What'd you do? What is that cheat code? Did you beat that level? Because a lot of my kids have never had that experience. They don't know what there is to gain from another human being. And a lot of that has to do with anxiety that I'm going to talk about. But my goal was to get them to see the relevance in it, to teach them to listen and to pay attention and to ask questions. That was at the bare bones level. So a lot of people think, oh, just put them in the lunchroom. Well, first of all, that's going to be overstimulating. And second of all, I don't know that they know what to do in the lunchroom. I don't even know if they could eat and listen at the same time. So these are all things to think about. Then in this process, I can teach them the give and take in conversation. So then when we, let's say, had this down, I would try to teach them to ask the other person a question. So I can teach, and we don't have a ton of time today, but I can teach kids to avoid the monologue. If somebody says, what did you do the weekend? You could say 3 things about your monologue. 3 and only 3, not 4, not 5, 3 things. And then you can ask, would you like to hear more? And if they say no, you stop. And then you say, what did you do this weekend? So I can actually teach some pretty basic concrete skills to make kids successful socially at a starting level. So if I'm the kid and then I teach the kids, you ask Susan, what's she doing this weekend? And she says, I'm going bowling. And then I say to my kids, so what do you need to do Monday? And they don't know until I teach them. I say, you asked Susan how was bowling. And they, a lot of my kids are like, well, why would I ask her? I don't care. It's like, well, this is the social engagement. You want to get to know Susan, you say, oh, how was bowling? And then you ask her Friday. And then as you get to know her, maybe you say, hey, I like bowling too. Maybe we both should go bowling. But my kids don't engage in this process. They really don't. So these are some simple things that we can do. And that's part of the small talk. So I try to teach people, I really believe, man, I think a high percentage of our interactions are small talk. A high percentage. How are you? Fine. How are you? When I get home tonight and I see my neighbor, I'm going to say, hey, Tim, how are you? And he's going to say, great, Tim, how are you? And I might say, oh, good. How are the kids? We're not getting into any interpersonal depth of what we're talking about. We're just acknowledging somebody, another human being that lives next door to me. So sometimes I have to teach my kids to understand that concept because they're very goal driven. You don't have anything to offer me. I'm not saying anything to you type of thing. So this is kind of part of the mind shift I'm going to talk about, but teaching them what that looks like. So then it comes to, and I talked about groups, joining activities, getting involved in groups. So in what I tell a lot of people, and I told a kid last night, he's in high school, you don't have the same social opportunities with same age peers that you do in public school or college. It doesn't work that way. You have an abundance of people that are your same age, that are there for hours, that share a lot of interests. You might get a job. Maybe there's some young adults that work there. Maybe there isn't. But as those opportunities, once you get out of college, it's much harder. I struggle with my 25-year-olds that want to socialize. They don't want to go to the bars downtown St. Charles where I live. They don't want to do that. What do I tell them to do? We're pretty limited. They don't go to church because I bring up a church group. Go to a church group. Now there's something called Meetup. It's not a dating site. It's a site to make friends. Try to get them to do that. But what I will tell you, if you don't do these things when they're younger, grade school, middle school, high school, the anxiety increases. The anxiety increases the older we get, the more complex the world gets, the harder it is to get these kids out. So, the Geneva Public Library by my office has 2 young adult groups. They have a Dungeons and Dragons group that meets once a month, and they have a book club for young adults. My problem is I can't get my kids to go to the group because they don't have a lot of experiences with going to a new group. Everyone feels anxious when they go to a new group, but the more we do it, the more I can go back to what I said before, take data and say, oh, do you remember when you started that group in 5th grade, you were really nervous, but then you went in, you had a great time. Do you remember that? Why would this group be any different? You have those skills. What I'll do with some of my other kids as they get a little bit higher up, I'll have them go on yahoo.com or Google and try to find trends that are going on in the world to bring up. a lot of my kids aren't necessarily real worldly. Most kids aren't, but let's have some topics. There's story after story after story. It doesn't have to be political. It doesn't have to be anything too in depth. It could be some guy caught a huge shark off the Florida Keys, but at least you have conversations. So then at a higher level, I will say, hey, did you see this? Did you hear about that? Simple things that you can do. So then before they go out, you can sit down with them at the kitchen table and say, okay, what are the things we talked about? What are the things you could bring up? What are the questions you could ask? Because if we don't map it out and get it into their heads, and that anxiety kicks in, it's like it erases the slate. So these are just simple things you can look at doing. I've kind of talked about a lot of this. There's a practice effect, talking about what we're going to do before we go, talk about the rules, some of the consequences of the choices we make. Very simple things, but so much of this is manual teaching, and it's being proactive. I'm going to talk a lot about motivation. It's a big thing. So I brought up anxiety quite a bit. The way I describe anxiety to people is it's hard to see sometimes. Most of my kids aren't the kids flipping desks in school. Teachers will say, well, they must not be anxious. They didn't raise their hand. They didn't say anything. And I look at them like, well, first of all, they have a social challenge and they have anxiety. They are not raising their hand in front of the whole class saying, I have a question or I'm struggling or I need a break. It doesn't work that way. If you want to go up to them individually and talk to them, I tease a lot. I wish their hair turned blue so I could walk in the classroom and say, oh, those 6 kids are anxious because their hair is blue. I know they haven't said anything. They haven't raised their hand, but it doesn't really work that way. So you got to get to know a child to be able to talk to them. And a lot of my kids don't like being talked to in front of other kids. We're going to do it later. We're going to do it behind the scenes. Maybe we send an email. But with anxiety, I describe for people, it's like looking at a tree and seeing the branches and seeing the leaves. We all recognize it. That's anxiety. What we don't do sometimes is analyze where are the roots of it. What is behind the anxiety? What's driving it? A lot of times when it comes to socializing, it's irrational fears. So a lot of my kids with anxiety try to make sense of why I feel this way. The anxiety is true. How they define it a lot of times from a social perspective is incorrect. So I'm not going to talk because I can't talk, or I don't know what to say, or I'm not going to advocate because the teacher will be mad. So part of it is figuring out what the roots are so we can dissect the roots and get them to think more rationally. Because I can create 2 columns with kids. They're black and white thinking. This is rational and this is irrational. And so I can teach them in the moment to take a step back. Is that really rational? You could go and say hi to your classmate, and I guess they could turn around and punch you in the face. I suppose that's a possibility, but when we put that in the rational or irrational column, because that's where the anxiety goes. We get those what ifs and what ifs. And then kids will say to me, everyone thinks I'm weird. And I always ask the same question. Tell me the data. When has somebody called you weird? And generally it happens, but generally they don't have a lot of data. But when the anxiety kicks in, they try to make sense of why they feel this way. Well, I feel this way because everyone thinks I'm weird. That's not the case. It's not really how it works, but I have to dissect that, figure out the roots, and then try to reprogram some of that thinking. Otherwise, we get stuck. And the problem with anxiety in socializing is it's very easy to avoid. I just don't do it. I don't go to the dance. I don't go to homecoming. I don't go to the football game. I don't join a group because of the anxiety. I stay home. The problem, as I said earlier, is the anxiety just keeps getting higher and higher and higher. It doesn't change. It doesn't get better unless we're out, we're doing. So it's a lot of my job is trying to motivate families, motivate kids to get out, to deal with the anxiety, to push through the anxiety, to think more rationally. It's interesting. One of the top phobias in the world is public speaking. Spiders are high. Public speaking is high. People are more afraid of public speaking than death. So why is that? So when you really break down what I'm talking about, I teach kids all the time. There's 2 buckets when it comes to socializing. There's ability, and then there's anxiety. 99% of the kids that walk into my office can have a conversation with me. They have a command of the English language. They can talk about topics that have interest to them. So they have the ability, and I'm not talking about reading subtle social cues or those types of things, but just to talk and have a conversation. But what happens is that anxiety kicks in, and then all of a sudden we're not going, we're questioning our ability. So when you think about the number one of the top fears in the world is public speaking, it's not that people can't speak. It's not that they don't have a command of the language. It's not that they don't understand certain topics. That is anxiety. That's what it is. And if I can get my kids to better understand this process and realize they have the ability, that's how I build confidence. That's how I get them to go to the, because the mantra is I have the ability. Dr. Wahlberg has taught me what to say. He's taught me what to do. I know what questions to ask. So that's the biggest thing. So social anxiety, people with just plain social anxiety have the social skills to engage in conversation. It's the group, it's more people. What people don't understand also, a lot of my kids do better one-on-one. Well, what you have to understand is when I'm sitting with one person, I have one set of data. One, just that person. When another person enters this conversation, I have tripled the data I have to process. I process one person's data, the other person's data, and then I have to process the data between those two people. Because I don't shut my brain off when they start talking because I have to pay attention to what they're saying. So adding one person to a conversation triples the data that I have to process. And it works that way exponentially. So now there's 3 people with me. We've tripled the data again that I have to process. So it can be complex. So I talked about this earlier, the mind shift piece. The thing about mind shift is I have to get them off of these almost, this anxiety, this traumatic, this irrational, catastrophizing way of thinking. I have to shift it to, actually, I do have the ability to do what you're saying. Because I'll say to kids in my office, you're doing it now. You're doing it with me. So let's not use the word I can't do it. You can certainly use the word in my office. It's hard for you. You could certainly say it creates a lot of anxiety, but we're going to eliminate the word can't. Because if you can't do it, you couldn't do it in my office. So these are just kind of simple things to think about. Another one is motivation. I can't stress this enough. A lot of my kids aren't doing these things without motivation. Half the kids won't come to my office without motivation. I should buy stock in McDonald's because half my kids get to have McDonald's after they come to my office because that's what gets them here. So we have to think about what motivates our kids to get them to do the things that we know will help them. I'm not asking parents to do things that I think will be harmful. There might be some bumps along the way, but I know what the backside looks like. I don't want my kids 25 living in the basement, not working, not going to school, miserable. I don't want that, which means we have to push a little. And there's 2 types of motivation. There's intrinsic and extrinsic. My kids tend to do very well with extrinsic motivation. What's in it for me? So I had a dad in here. He thought I had 3 heads when I told him this. His son was 16, had the skills, wasn't socializing, wouldn't call, wouldn't go out, wouldn't do anything with friends. And I told his dad, well, he's very extrinsically motivated. What does he want? He goes, he wants to drive. He's got a permit. And I said, well, what if you said you'll take him driving with his permit after he's called somebody or he's gone out with somebody? And the dad looked at me like I had 3 heads. He's like, what are you talking about? I said, well, the one thing I know is he's not going to do it without motivation. You've already told me that. He's proven that for 16 years. And the dad said, okay, I'll try it. And it worked because the kid wanted to drive. So we're accomplishing 2 things. The kid's going to get what he wants anyway. Why don't we tie it into something that's motivating? Intrinsic motivation is socially based. Intrinsic motivation is, I'm going to do it to make mom and dad happy. I'm going to do it to make the teacher happy. I'm going to do it because other kids are doing it. And that's more of a social construct. A lot of my kids don't have that same intrinsic motivation. So we have to find other ways to motivate them. I've already talked about small talk with motivation. I like to start with positive. I like to start with what you're going to gain from it, what's going to happen. With groups, my kids always say, I don't want to join a group. I'm not joining a group. So I'll tell parents, pick 3 groups you think your kid might kind of be interested in. And then tell them, you could pick one of these 3. And if you don't pick one of these 3, I'll pick one for you. And if you don't go to that group and engage to some capacity, you're not playing video games that night or something along those lines. Otherwise, my kids don't do it. And I'm telling you, the anxiety just keeps going up if they're not taking advantage of these opportunities that they have when they're younger. It doesn't happen when they get older. I've talked about executive functioning. I've talked about prompting fire. One of the things I added here is executive functioning means we think before we do the behavior and we think about the outcome. A lot of my kids aren't engaging in thinking about what the outcome might be. We engage in the behavior, we get this outcome, we're almost surprised, shocked by this outcome, like how, I didn't know. I didn't know I'd get in trouble. I didn't know this would happen. So at higher levels, I taught a girl this morning who's an accountant, 28 years old in Kentucky, how to put that stop sign up because she engages in the behavior a little too quick, and then the outcomes aren't good at her accounting practice she's working for. And so, I said, and I told her, you can envision a stop sign. Because when somebody's critical with her, she just gets this eruption of emotions and just comes barking out, which doesn't go well. And so you could see the wheels turning. She's like, oh, so I just stop, take a breath. Yes. And you don't even have to respond then. You could say, can I get back to you? But if you're calm, you're not going to have the same response, and you can be much more rational when you're calm. She's 28 years old, has a college degree, has had 5 accounting jobs, and now she's kept this job for a while, and her biggest problems were always social. She's a great accountant. And then, so I'm trying to enforce that second part of the thinking. We're going to stop. We're going to take a breath. And I talked about prompting prior, kind of being ahead of things. This slide is, I'm not going to cover that. If you have questions about it, some of it applies to what I'm talking about. But I kept my promise, 45 minutes. Does anyone have any questions?
I'm going to start you off. That was excellent. Do you talk about the importance of posture and eye contact when you're teaching these social skills?
Yes, I tend to focus on the anxiety first, because if I can build confidence, that tends to be a little easier. Eye contact is an interesting animal. I think that there's a stereotype that, all kids on the spectrum have poor eye contact. I don't find that to be true. I think it's something that we can practice, but the eye contact is wildly overstimulating for a lot of kids, like shut them down. So what I'll do is I'll work on, look at my chin, look at my shoulder, look at my cheek, look at my forehead. Or I also teach kids to say, I'm listening to you. My eye contact isn't great, but that doesn't mean I'm not listening. So please don't take offense to it. But, I sometimes get a little overwhelmed if I look at somebody or I don't remember what they're saying. So I can teach ways to compensate, and I can teach ways to improve. Posture is, we talk about stand up straight, or things like that. But I'm, trying to tackle more of that mind shift, that anxiety, building the confidence piece. But honestly, most of my kids have pretty decent eye contact. And then what you find with a lot of kids is the more they get to know you, the more comfortable they get, the more the eye contact increases. But, some of my strategies with some of my older kids is to just say, that's hard for me. Be transparent. That's difficult for me. That's not that I'm not listening. It's not that I don't care about you. I have 2 girls I work with, teenagers, young adults right now, that say, I am quick to respond, and sometimes it's blunt. I'm not trying to be mean. I'm not trying to offend you. I'm very blunt. Just let's put it on the table, so that I try to teach kids, if you put it on the table, you're not allowing the person to make an assumption. Because when you allow people to make assumptions, they're generally wrong. This happens a lot where my kids get invited out, the anxiety kicks in, they don't go. Well, what do the other kids think? They think they don't like them. We've asked you 10 times, you say no every time. Obviously, you don't like us. That's not true. It's not that my kids don't like them. The anxiety kicks in, they say no. Well, kids stop asking. And that's a very consistent trend that I see. But it's the anxiety that stops them, and then they don't go. So if we can't chew away at that, they get stuck, and then they don't, they don't go, and then they get depressed because they don't have friends. And a lot of times they don't see their contribution to this process, or they don't ask, how was your weekend? They say nothing. It's amazing how many kids don't have the basic skills. And again, with a lot of that black and white thinking, in the beginning, it's, well, I don't care what Joey did over the weekend. Do you know what I mean? So that's the process that goes into it. But if you get to know Joey's playing a video game you like, and Joey's a couple levels ahead, Joey is an ally, right? Joey's somebody that could help you. There's benefit to getting to know Joey. A lot of my kids don't recognize that until we kind of take them through this process.
You've got a question here that I also had. Okay, we don't have you. Now what?
Well, I guess I would find somebody that you feel confident understands autism, understands a social disability at a grass, bare bones basement level. Like today, you got a lot of foundation. You've got to really have a therapist or somebody that you trust that has that foundational understanding. I think the reason a lot of my kids like me is I speak their language. I understand. I get it. I understand. So like I said, I joke in my office all the time because I'll say it's not that easy. And I'll say, I never said it was easy. Those words do not come out of these lips sitting in this office because it's not easy. I never said it was easy. It's going to be hard work, but you told me you wanted to make some friends. And I'm trying to help you get there, and it's going to be hard work. We're going to get in the trenches, but you really have to understand where they're coming from, what they're processing. So what I would tell parents is find somebody that you feel like understands where we're coming from. Do you know what I mean? Understands this whole process. It's hard. My families go to IEP meetings. My daughter has a learning disability. She has a reading disability. And I used to go to the IEP meetings. And if I felt like some of the staff were a little surly, I'd say, how many people, you're sitting there with 10, 12 people, right? And fortunately, I'm a person that's well educated in this whole process. Parents aren't, they're not. And so I'd sit down and before my daughter came in, I'd say, how many people sitting in this room of you 10, 12 people had a reading disability or have a reading disability? And they'd all kind of look around. They'd say, okay, so none of you, not one of you shares my daughter's perspective of what it's like to go to school, and 90% of it's reading. So none of you share that perspective. You guys all like school so much, you came back. You came back to this environment because you didn't struggle with homework. You didn't struggle with reading. You didn't struggle with social anxiety. You didn't struggle with getting yourself to school. So to make me happy and make my daughter functional, we have to follow the IEP. You have to stick with this IEP so that she's not frustrated. All I want is her to not hate school. And think about when you sit down as a parent in an IEP meeting with a child with autism. You're talking about something at another level. My daughter didn't have a social challenge. She liked the social aspects of school, and that's really what got her through school. And when all of us think about going to school, like I have a PhD and I didn't like school, but I like socializing. I like the groups I was in. I played a couple sports. I mean, I didn't like homework. There were certain things I liked to learn, but I learned how to learn. I learned how to do things I don't like. And I didn't talk about this today, but a lot of my work with families is functional life skills. A lot of the curriculum, we don't use the curriculum. We use functional life skills that we got from going to school. Any one of us goes back to school right now and takes your finals. You pick the class, you pick the teacher, you can't study, you go back and take finals from high school. How many think they would pass? I would fail every one of them unless I could study. So what does that tell us? So I didn't really learn anything in high school? Well, no, I don't remember all the details of the curriculum. What I learned how to do is get myself up, work with other people, control my anxiety, do things I don't want, stay organized. Functional life skills is what public education teaches. When we get to our jobs or our careers, we apply the functional life skills, not what I learned in history and as a sophomore in high school. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that, and we have these environments, beautiful environments, that are there to teach math, science, English, but we don't have a social skills curriculum. We don't have an executive functioning curriculum, which I wish we did, but we don't, because you're supposed to just learn that by coming. Just show up, figure it out, figure out how to organize, figure out how to get yourself up, figure out how to socialize. And these are kids that need more. They need more than that. And I can't necessarily blame the environment. You know what I mean? The way it's set up now, if you need social skill work in a public school, you get 30 minutes a week of social work. And that's the system. Like, that's just the system. And, it's frustrating to me, but I can't change the system.
What suggestions do you have for a child gets that rejection? They're just how do I help that child who's just
So that's a great question, because I have a young man named Brady that I see that we've got over that hump, had a lot of bad experience, a lot of bad experiences. So what I try to do, it's a process. So I try to do a lot of what we talked about today: build the confidence, talk about the ability versus the anxiety, shift the mindset. And then I have to work with the parents and maybe the school to increase the probability of success on where we want to plug this kid in. So we finally talked him into doing some group at school. Can't remember what it's called now. It's like the group that does picks up garbage and community service stuff. I can't remember. There's a weird name for it. I can't remember it for the life of me. But I'm looking at that with mom and dad, because he's not going to church group, because that has a relatively high probability of decent kids, right? So I send him to this group, and he starts to meet some people, and they're actually nice to him. So then I can take the next step, because remember, I've taught the foundation. So we got to work on, how do you get a phone number? He's a junior in high school. We're working on, how do you get a phone number? How do you ask questions? How do you listen? How do you ask, what are you doing this weekend? And then, what I'll do with my kids a lot to help them with the anxiety is, we'll send a text message sitting in my office. I'll say, do you have Joe's number? So let's talk about what we could say to Joe. Let's say to Joe, hey, what are you doing this weekend? And we know Joe from the community service group, and we play the 1/3 rule. And Joe's the one kid you've talked to a few times now, you seem to jive with. Those are the kind of things I do. But there's no guarantees. There's no guarantees. But I might talk to a school social worker and say, hey, can you help me out a little bit here? Because, Brady's not the only kid like this in your school. Do you have another good, solid, nice kid that's maybe, a little shy, looking for a friend? Where I'm not telling my kids to go out for the football team.
yeah, yeah.
And then I have a lot of kids. I really like this. I have a lot of success with helping in the theater, like stage crew. Do you know what I mean? That tends to work real well. Higher probability of success. I have a kid that runs it all. Track team, cross country team, higher probability of success. Just generally better. I mean, I'm not trying to stereotype, but generally speaking, higher probability of success. Church group, parents can work with the youth pastor. Hey, let's get a mentor. Kid, who's your best kid here, type A, that can take him under his wing. Say, come and join us. Don't sit over at that table by yourself. Come over, be a part of this, and keep pushing. Because then we can educate the youth pastor, which helps my kids, because we can stimulate some of that happening. Because a lot of my kids have taken their lumps. There's no lying there.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, there's no lying. It hasn't gone well. And I have a kid that I work with who contributes to a lot of it, which is hard. He just fires back, and he's got these digs, but he doesn't see it. A lot of my kids have no accountability. I'm doing this because they did that. Well, they had no intention of being mean. Like, let's start with that. You missed that whole thing, and you fire a shot across the bow, and they were just kind of having fun. They weren't trying to be mean. But my kids are so black and white, and I can't be a fly on the wall and say, oh, no, don't say anything. He was just having fun.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's complex.
Yeah.
It's complex. But again, if I can get people to focus on the basics, then we can start to increase the probability of success. And a lot of my kids, they just want a friend. They don't need 20. Nobody has 20 friends. I don't have 20 best friends. I have a couple. I have a couple in the bullseye. I have a lot of people in the outer ring that I know a little bit about. They're not in my bullseye. So trying to get them to that point. And that's where it's hard to battle the internet, because they have somebody that they're talking to in Australia or England, or, it's hard.
Yeah.
Very hard.
Going to take one last question here.
Sure.
How do you deal with a child who has, I think it's supposed to be OCD, ADHD, and autism, where it's hard to figure out if it's normal teenage behavior or is it the other diagnoses at play?
Well, again, I would try to evaluate what are the roots. So almost all the kids I see on the spectrum have comorbidity. Almost all of them have ADHD. Almost all of them, I would call it OCD tendencies, that is driven in the need for control from the anxiety. So if I do this and set this up, it lowers my anxiety. If I say these things in my head, that's where I see a lot of that OCD coming from. And the thing about ADHD, again, you really have to look at where is it coming from. So in the United States, we say it's biological, take a stimulant, right? It's biological. You have chemicals in your brain, take this. Well, that's a small percentage of my kids on the spectrum, because it could be that, or it could be a sensory issue, could be an anxiety issue, could be a depression issue, could be a social issue, could be a motivation issue, could be I don't like the teacher issue. Well, the problem with all of those, besides the first one, is stimulants make it worse. So if we don't figure out what the roots are, with a lot of my kids, when they develop OCD tendencies, it's for that they want to control, and they're grasping to try to control to lower their anxiety. So they get into these OCD kind of patterns. It's a beautiful thing though, when they decide they're done with it. A lot of my kids are like, yeah, I'm done. I don't want to do that anymore. So the OCD, the way I distinguish between the two, people that have true OCD and are washing their hands for 20 minutes, they know it's kind of silly. Like they'll tell you, I know this is goofy, and they'll keep washing their hands. My kids don't think it's goofy. Like I have to do this. And what I would tell you about rituals is rituals don't get smaller. They get larger. So we start with 5 stuffed animals. We got to say goodnight to all of them. All of a sudden there's 6 stuffed animals. There's 10 stuffed animals. Your 10-minute ritual is now 20 minutes. So I try to teach people how to put boundaries on it. You know, you can only have 5 stuffed animals. You want to bring in 6, one's got to go out. You know what I mean? Like we'll do 5. And then again, I look at what is the drive. There is a reason behind behavior. Unless somebody's psychotic, there is a reason they're doing what they're doing. So many people don't ask why. Why? You know, a teacher says to me, you know, Joey's getting out of his seat 50 times during math. And I'll say, why? Well, I don't know. That's your job. Well, there's a reason. Like, let's figure out the why. If we can figure out the why, we can get in front of it. You know, they want a behavioral plan to punish Joey because he's getting out of his seat. You know what I mean? Like, he can't go out for recess then. I'm like, no. Why? Why is he getting out of his seat? Let's figure out the why. Maybe he needs a break. Maybe he's not understanding math. Maybe he doesn't know how to self-advocate. Maybe he's overstimulated. I don't know. But there is a reason. So if we can figure out the reason, and Joey doesn't know how to articulate it. A lot of my kids don't know how to articulate it. They don't know that other kids think differently. They're thinking, why am I the one that has to get out of my seat? You know, and I tell a lot of people, it irritates me when my kids, you know, get treated like it's a choice. And I say, you know, I used to say this in IEP meetings with my daughter. Do you think she woke up one day and said, I want to be the kid that can't read? That's what I want to do. You know, you think these kids say, I want to be the one that doesn't fit in? So kind of irritates me when
We love your passion.
I get a little fired up.
No, you're talking to the right group here for that, Dr. Wahlberg. Thank you.
But that, I mean, that's our battle. We're the advocates.
Yeah.
You know, our job, you know, I kind of take it that, you know, that's my job, is to educate. Yeah. That doesn't mean people are going to listen. That doesn't mean they're going to believe me. But if we don't do it, you know, we leave these kids on an island, man. You know, we really do. And you could see where the comorbidity of depression and anxiety, you know, it's not going the way they want it to go. And I'm not saying the way they want it is realistic either, but they're not waking up. They're going to school. I couldn't imagine a worse place for a child with autism, you know, on every level. And that's where we send them. And we did, not that we have a choice, I get it, but it's the reality. So any way we can make it better for them, I feel like that's what we all need.
Well, you've done an excellent job of
Thank you.
All of us today. And for those of you that are listening, please let others know we are going to be back at 7 p.m. Central. We're going to tackle this again. We're going to be looking for your questions. And so I'm so excited to spend the day with you, Dr. Wahlberg.
Yes, I look forward to it.
And grateful to everyone who joined us. So we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. See you tonight. So I'll see you tonight, okay?
You bet.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yep.
So very good. You said you were going to get into eye contact. So let's go there for a minute.
Okay. So eye contact, like I said, I would say 75% of the higher functioning individuals I see with social challenges have pretty decent eye contact, and the ones that don't, there's a couple ways that I look at it. I can try to teach them how to work in the direction of eye contact. And what I start with is maybe look at my chin, maybe look at my cheek, maybe look at my forehead. Just look at me for a second and look away so we can work on that. A lot of times eye contact improves as they get to know people. But another thing that I also teach my kids and maybe young adults to do is to say to people, I am listening to you. I am processing what you're saying. Eye contact, I'm not real good at it. So even though I'm not looking at you, I'm still listening to you. I'm not trying to be rude. So there's different avenues, but it's very contingent and based on the individual that I'm working with on what route to take. But you can shape that behavior. You can work in that direction. But if you talk to some of the kids that can articulate, eye contact completely overwhelms them, completely shuts them down. It's like it freezes them because there's so much stimulation that comes in. But I think you can work in that direction with practice. The whole look at me right from the beginning can be a little overwhelming. And I'll have kids in my office that say, would you rather have me look at you or would you rather have me listen to you? And my option is listen to me. Like, I want you to process what I'm saying. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And, I think a lot of people, when they're working with my kids, think if you don't look at me, you're not respecting me. And so my kids will look at them, but they won't hear a word. It's like Charlie Brown's teacher then, so it's having that level of understanding. But I think you can shape that behavior and get them more comfortable. And then I teach them very specific skills. You're going to look at my chin for a second. You're going to look away. You look at my cheek for a second, count to 10 and look away. Whatever it is, try to make it more black and white, because that's really, a lot of the kids I see, that's how their brains work. It's kind of all or none. I'm trying to teach some of that middle ground, but the more I can quantify it, the easier it is to make sense to them. And that's something. So, when I'm working with kids, I don't use a lot of emotional language. I try to be very direct, very specific. I like to come up with a plan. This is what we're going to work on. This is what we're going to do. We make a list. We have scripts. Things that are tangible, that are concrete. I use a ton of visuals. I want them to see. I try to teach a lot of my kids that, what's interesting about anxiety for humans is we have to give ourselves permission to feel it. You can really lean on me, make me feel pretty stressed, but ultimately I have to decide. Now, unless you have generalized anxiety disorder, it's usually situationally based. It's based on what somebody's telling me, somebody's doing to me, what somebody's saying to me. And so I try to shift the mindset of a lot of my kids to get them to see that they need to learn to control themselves, not the people around them.
Mm-hmm.
And when I can get that shift, I can build confidence and get them to understand that they truly do decide, if we're going to feel anxious. I get some kids that are afraid of storms and some kids that aren't. Well, the kids that aren't have made a decision somewhere along the line. They've evaluated the data. They decided it doesn't bother me. I'm going to go in my basement, because they have processed it in a way that doesn't create anxiety for them. And that's what can happen socially is if you can build that confidence, you start processing differently. It's a different mindset. You realize maybe you're a little quirky. Okay. Maybe you need things repeated. Okay. That's not the end of the world. You could say, I don't understand. That's okay. But if I can build confidence, I can teach them those little skills to use to be successful. Another thing about socializing, a lot of my kids do better with one-on-one. Mm-hmm. And what we don't understand is when I'm talking to one person, I have one set of data, me and that other person. I don't have to process anything else. When somebody else comes into the equation, I've tripled my data. I have to follow this person, and then I got to follow their conversation. Yeah. So for a lot of my kids, they do a lot better with one. So in my groups, it's one person talking at a time. It's a role that I have in my groups, and that's not necessarily how it happens at the lunch table, but that's how I start, because I'm trying to teach those basic prerequisite skills of listening and asking questions. Let's get engaged. Because the beauty of asking a question, the beauty of it is I don't have to know anything about what you're talking about to ask a question. I can say, I really don't know what you're talking about. Could you explain that a little bit more? I don't have to have knowledge on it. A lot of my kids, again, have those irrational thoughts. I can't get into a conversation unless I have something great to say, something brilliant. something to contribute. That's not true. That's not how it works. But again, it's that irrational thinking which prevents them from doing it, which creates the anxiety. So if you can build a little bit of that confidence, then they can start to use some of the strategies we talked about tonight. They are willing to go to groups, and it's so fun to watch them blossom because they're like, it's kind of fun to have a friend. I got somebody to text, I got somebody to do something with. It's fantastic. It's really fun to watch. But if I think we assume things that aren't there. We assume they know when they don't. And a lot of times in my office, I'll say, "Do you understand what I said?" And the kids will say, "Yep." And I'll look at the parents and say, "Do you think they understand what I said?" And they'll say, "Oh yeah, they said yes." And I'll look at the kid and I'll say, "What did I say?" They'll say, "I have no idea." And the parents will say, "Why did you say you understood?" Well, they're saying they understood to stop me. Or they'll say, "I don't know." So one of the rules in my office is you can't say I don't know. Because I think some of my kids won't even process the question. I can say, "What color's your shirt?" They'll say, "I don't know." So I say, I make a rule, we can't say I don't know. Make something up, whatever, but you can't say I don't know because they get in that habit. Because if you say I don't know to somebody, they stop. They don't ask any more questions. So, I mean, I know we don't have a ton of time tonight. I can't get into a lot of the real intricacies of some of the things that I do, but this gives you, I think, a framework of where to come from. And then I think when you focus on the basics, you can learn, do they really understand or do they not? And then you can kind of scaffold from there. But if you don't build that confidence, if you don't get in front of that anxiety, you can't just send them to group. They have to have some of these prerequisite skills, or they don't know they really don't know what to do. And then that's a negative experience. Even though nothing was said to them or nobody bullied them, it's still perceived by them as a negative experience.
What about body posturing? Do you talk about that with your clients as well? Do you think that's a very important skill?
Yes. So I talk about body posturing. This one is a little easier for me because I talk about kind of the arm rule. I think, as far as proximity, we practice some of the things about, how they stand, where they orient themselves. Those are things that are a little simpler because they're a little more black and white. A little girl I saw today, some of the little ones are all over my office and they're on my lap and they're, climbing around and she's talking to, she comes right up to me, just talking to me and I start leaning in a little bit, I'm like, "How does this feel?" She goes, "That's really uncomfortable," and so I taught her, we're going to stand, in different countries are different, but in the United States, it's generally, we're going to stand at arm's length kind of thing. We're not going to get too close, but those are skills that are a little bit easier because I can make those a little more black and white. When I talk about proximity, we talk about, the social filter, sometimes we might think it, but maybe we're not going to say it. So we'll talk about some of those things. But that's a good question because a lot of my kids don't, they don't understand that unless they're taught. So again, I can't assume that they know. And I also do therapy very different. I have my parents involved in therapy because with a lot of my kids, their perspective on what's going on generally is not the same as what everyone else's would be. So I need feedback to know. And a lot of my kids would come in and say, "Everything's great. Everything's great. I don't know why my parents are sending me here." But then I hear from the parents, they're failing 3 classes. They don't talk to anyone. They don't leave the house. So I do things very differently because a lot of what I talked about tonight, I teach parents. And then because I only see the kid for a little bit. And then you're going out, you're going home. The parents are the ones that are driving the ship. So I kind of took everything I learned in graduate school and turned it upside down. That didn't work. I'm very direct. I'm very, we're getting to the business. We're talking about things. I really want to come up with a plan. So when my parents leave, there's always a plan. And generally I focus on one thing because my parents that come into my office are very overwhelmed. These are kids that they got a lot of energy. They're hot. They're a lot of work. They're a lot of work compared to any other kids that I see. They're a lot of work. And if we do it the right way and we start with one thing, a lot of times I'm building parents' confidence. because they come in, they don't know. I mean, they really don't know what's going on. They don't know why. I got 3 kids, and then this one comes along, and they don't follow any of the rules that everyone else did. Everyone else did what we asked, and my kid says, "Why?"
Yeah.
It's time to do your chores. Why? I don't want to. And teachers are the same way. Teacher says, "Get your math book out." My kid says, "I don't want to." But if we shift it a little, then if the teachers better understand, I had to learn a long time ago, I can't take offense to what kids say to me or what,
Yeah.
I just can't. Most of the kids don't necessarily want to come here, especially in the beginning.
Sure.
That's not what they want to do. It's all of us that have the problem. They don't, you guys are all the issue.
Do you think there's a mistake that parents make, or that something comes to mind when they're trying to help their child, but really doesn't help at all?
Oh man, that's a great question. I think that the one of the biggest mistakes is they assume that they're thinking the same way they are. I
Mhm.
think so. I talked about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is more socially based. And so I get a lot of parents that run into this problem is the "I told you so." A lot of kids do that because they respect their parents. They want to make their parents happy. My kids don't necessarily possess that in the same way. So I'll teach parents, well, there's got to be something in it for them. I did a presentation one time and a mom stood up and said, "My kid doesn't brush his teeth." And I looked at her, he's like 10. I said, "Well, why would he?" She goes, What do you mean? He's going to get cavities." He's going, "That doesn't matter. That none of that's irrelevant data. You can tell him all day long he's going to get cavities. He doesn't like brushing his teeth. He sees it a waste of time." So that's where extrinsic motivation comes in. Extrinsic motivation is you don't brush your teeth, you don't get video games.
Mhm.
And I have some slides that I use about choices that kids make. So I think that's the biggest difference. So then my parents will say, "So I have to bribe my kid to get him to do the basics?" And I'll say, "Well, first of all, a bribe is when you ask somebody to do something that's maybe a little shady. Right? That's a bribe." But the problem that a lot of parents have is they're not going to necessarily do it because you said, "I told you so." They're going to do it because there's something in it for them.
Mhm.
So if you don't do your homework, you don't play video games. It's very simple. Tonight, a little girl sitting in here, she's 7. And I was talking about sensory things and what to do at home. And I said it works best with the little ones to take a picture of them actually physically doing it. Okay. And then you could say, "What do you feel like you need right now?" Maybe put 3 pictures on a page when my kids get wound up. And a mom said, "Oh, what a great idea. That would work great." And she looks at her daughter and says, Would you want to go around the house tonight and take pictures?" She goes, "No." Because she said, "Would you want?" And I said, "Okay, hold on, Mary. Tonight, I need you to go around and take pictures with your mom." And she goes, "Okay." Because you asked me, "Would you take out the garbage?" "No, thank you."
Mhm. Yeah.
But when so that's very different. And it's hard for families. And then you've got other kids that don't need that. You just say, "Take out the garbage." Okay. Do you know what I mean? And my kids, so they kind of grind against, and that's that social piece. And that's the motivation piece. Like, I'm not doing it. What do I benefit from that? And
Yeah.
that's the rub in school for a lot of my kids. They don't care. You're going to fail the class. Okay. Because grades are more intrinsic motivation.
Yeah.
My kids do. Okay, I'm going to fail. Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about everybody, but a lot of my kids.
Mm.
So it's like taking parenting and turning it on its head.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so when I can get parents to understand that and make it very simple, that, kind of that first first you're going to come home, you're going to take a sensory break. Then you're going to have a snack, take a sensory break. Then you're going to do your homework. And remember, we're not just going to write 3 for every math problem. We're going to actually do the math problems, and we're going to do it at a certain level that we find satisfactory. And then you can play video games. That's what's in it for you. There's something, so that can be very different for a lot of parents, and just understanding the language, how to speak to your child. It's different. It's so much more direct, so much more linear.
We're getting close to the end. Sensory break. What do you mean?
So what I was talking about in that first slide is a lot of my kids are overstimulated by the sensory environment. It's too much, it's too loud, it's too fast. So our sensory systems are made up of a ton of different systems. So you have your visual system, your sense of smell, your sense of taste, your hearing, your gut processing food, your kinesthetic movement, your proprioceptive movement, your vestibular movement. And a lot of my kids, when they process that information, it's not that, like, if they have tactile sensitivity, there's more neurons in their arm. But when that information is processed in their brain, it's tenfold.
Mhm.
So we put a shirt on, and what should happen naturally, I'm sure it happened to everyone listening tonight, you put your clothes on in the morning, you feel them, but really quickly, your body, your brain says, not a problem, not dangerous. And it almost eliminates that sensory input. For a lot of my kids, their brain doesn't eliminate sensory input. And then, when you go to an early childhood classroom, it's easy to find those kids because they're usually the ones that are naked or taking their shoes off, taking their shirts off. So they eliminate the sensory. So what I mean by a sensory activity after school is if we can regulate the sensory in some of the kids, it calms their bodies down. So another girl I had in tonight is all over my office, all over the place. And I said, why don't we do 100 jumping jacks? Or no, I said 50. And she said, I'll do 100. And I said, okay. She literally did 100 jumping jacks and then sat on my couch. So sensory breaks help regulate their systems because their systems struggle regulating automatically. I talked about that automaticity at the beginning. Most kids, when they process information, it's not times 10. It's not scrambled. It just comes in, it's processed, the brain looks at it, like a fan or lights or being hungry or smells. We're hardwired, unless it's dangerous, to habituate to it. We ignore it. It's irrelevant. I have kids that can hear fluorescent lights because they're so sensitive to that. I have kids that can see them flickering. I have kids that visual systems compromise because when the light hits a white piece of paper and reflects into their eyes, it's overstimulating. And there's a lot of things you can do for that. But getting the kids to regulate, and what my kids want to do is come home and get on a computer. Well, what I think they do is they take all that unrest, they put it on the shelf, and they focus on the computer. And they stop because they're focused on the computer. But as soon as you try to shut the computer off, all that unrest comes back. And it's generally physical. Swinging is very popular, jumping, a squeeze machine, that deep pressure. All of that really works to calm the system down because they're coming home pretty wound tight. And most of my kids don't want to stand out in school. They don't want to draw attention to themselves. So they hold it together and they get home and it's like an explosion. I mean, it's just because all of that's been so tight. So I tell my parents, like I told this mom tonight, I had this little girl years ago and she would come home, drop everything. Nobody talked to her. She walked right out the back door and got on the swing. And she knew she could be on the swing as long as she wanted. But when she was done with the swing, when she felt, she was a little bit older, so she could recognize her body calming down. And we said, don't come in the house until you're ready to hang your coat up, put your backpack away, do your homework, maybe do a chore, and stay on the swing until you feel in your brain and your body that you're ready to come in. And she went out no matter the temperature. That's what she did. So she regulated. And then with the older kids, I teach them to take breaks, walk away. So I have kids at work that, we kind of organize their breaks a little bit differently. So when they feel overwhelmed, let their manager know, they go to a place. I have kids that go to the bathroom and do wall push-ups. I have some kids that will listen to music because music can do that same type of thing. But I try to teach them to recognize it before we get over the top. Because we'll get over the top. I mean, if it keeps building, and then we see behaviors that aren't so good. So I try to teach them to stay ahead of it. Even adults, I'll teach them how to go to weddings. Sit in the back, and when you're feeling overstimulated, go in the hall, go to the bathroom. Like, it doesn't look weird. Nobody usually say you're going to the bathroom because if it's getting overstimulating, you can't control the stimulus in the room. But you can leave the room or you can put earplugs in. There's a lot of different things that we could do. And then I talked about being proactive. I try to get kids to regulate their bodies before they go out, before they go to school, before they go to the party, before they go to the football game, So I'm trying to get them as regulated as possible with some sort of a sensory diet or a sensory plan in place. Because again, I always think in probabilities. I want to increase the probability of success. I'll have my parents pull into Walgreens. We're not going into Walgreens till we review the rules. We know what's going on. We know the expectations. You know, maybe there's a reward in there for good behavior, whatever it is. We have to do that before we go in. And then I'll tell my parents, you ask your child, are you ready to go in?
Yeah.
Let's not go in when we're not ready, because it's not going to go well. You know, don't take your, you know, I also tell parents to pay attention to timing when you can. You know, don't go to a restaurant where you're going to wait 45 minutes.
Yeah.
And it's loud and it smells, and, you know, let's try to, you know, think ahead. You know, and I tell my parents to be proactive, because I think for a lot of us, and I remember this when my kids were little, there's this hope. I hope this happens. I hope this goes better. I hope they don't get mad. I try to eliminate that. Let's be proactive. Let's be proactive, and then we increase the likelihood that it goes well, as opposed to hope. I hope this goes well. And so that's a difference in, you know, a little bit of a different way of looking at it. So a lot of my job is teaching parents how their kids' brain works. And it's different, you know, and they're not trying to make you mad. You know, this is just the way their brain works.
Yeah.
But, you know, it really grinds, you know, you say, you know, could you please take out the garbage? No. Why would I take out the garbage? This is not my house.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, that's difficult. But if I can get parents to understand it and start with some of the basics, they see progress, they see success. And that's really what I'm after. So I really don't sit and do talk therapy. You know, if parents think they're dropping their kid off in my office and leaving, they're in the wrong office, because I can't get anything done. You know, now I get some adolescents, some young adults that truly want to come, truly want to make a difference, listen to me, do the things that I teach. You know what I mean? But for the most part, I mean, I'll see a 15, 16-year-old with their parents. And I talk to them in the beginning. We're all on the same team. We're all working together. I want feedback from your parents. You know, obviously I want feedback from you, but I'm trying to educate parents at the same time I'm educating the child, because then I want the parents to go follow the plan. Does that make sense? So it's very different. Like, I really, you know, a lot of families, you know, the kids will walk in and I'll look around my office. They're like, where are the games? We're not playing games. I'm going to teach you how to control your brain. I'm going to teach you how to get in front of some of this stuff, you know, and I do things very differently in that regard.
Well, you taught us so much tonight, really, about understanding the basics and some of the specifics and the strategies. And I'm so grateful. It's been really an honor spending the day with you, sir.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
There's still so many people still here. This is where we go hug the kids, Dr. Wahlberg.
Well, did anyone have any questions?
I think you did it. I think you
Okay.
hit us up beautifully.
All
All
right.
day today. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you for your generosity with your time. I'm so
You're
grateful.
welcome.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
And your
Thanks for
wisdom
having me.
too. Have a good evening, everybody.
You too.
Take care.
Bye.